Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Oxford Policy Podcast. My name is Meredith Lehman, and I am joined today by my colleague, Marc Naro. And we have the great honor to welcome Professor Stefan Dercon, a professor here of economic policy at Oxford. Not only is Stefan a brilliant academic, but he also has extensive experience in the policy world. Between 2011 and 2017, he was the chief economist of the UK's Department of International Development. And from 2020 to 2022, he was the development policy advisor to successive foreign secretaries at the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office. So we are thrilled to gain his unique perspective here today at the nexus of policy and academia. So again, Professor Dercon, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. Great.
Thank you, Professor. So your latest book is called Gambling on Development, Why Some Countries Win or Lose. Can you explain us what does it mean, gambling on development?
Right. So look at the book, and it's in a bit of the work I'm trying to do at the moment, is I try to get some kind of comparative understanding why it is that some countries manage to start growing from, being very much low-income countries, and other countries can't quite take off. And, we have to recognize that, there's been a lot written about, what the fundamental long-term determinants are of growth and development. This is often to do with institutional development, with state capacity, and so on. But you have to start from somewhere. And actually, a lot of these low-income countries actually start from very weak institutions. There's plenty of corruption, there's political issues with whether it's autocracies or not very well-functioning democracies or whatever it is. So you have all kinds of weaknesses. So for me, what interests me is to try to understand a bit, how does that come about that actually some countries start growing? And of course, we have a recent, extremely interesting natural experiment going back to the late 1980s, early 1990s, which is actually low-income countries that were low income at that time. They were the fastest growing economies across the world. It did include at the time still the Chinas, the Indonesias, the Vietnams, countries that we saw subsequently growing really fast. But that's where they started from. And they were amongst these low-income countries. So it's kind of try to understand across different types of countries, because it's not just the East Asian ones, or even not Southeast Asia like Indonesia. We saw very fast growth in Ethiopia. We saw very fast growth in Ghana. And yes, it's all a bit with ups and downs and stuttering growth. It's rarely a very nice line. And so what I wanted to offer is some kind of, what would be a framework to think about why growth takes off and development takes off in certain types of settings, and why is it that it doesn't? And I now very quickly come into, when there's weak institutions, it's people with power in these contexts, in the here and now, that will matter most. So you want to look at the actions and behaviors, the motivations, the incentives of what I call in the book the elite. Now, why do I focus on them? Because they can make it happen, but they can make it also stop. Now, and then a final thing to actually understand on where the title comes from is that if countries begin to grow, begin to develop, it usually changes country. Incumbents may be put under pressure. New elites emerge, pressure from below may come. And so basically, actually growing and changing your country is actually quite risky for those who have power. And so that's not just politically, it's economic. And so the elites I'm talking about is not just political elites, it's also civil servant elites, military elites, traditional elites, all kinds of groups, and of course also business elites. And so what we see there, that actually, if you want to start to develop from a context where it's actually very few checks and balances exist, it's pretty much a gamble. What I find striking is that in recent times, a lot of countries and the elites within them seem to have taken that gamble. Now, I don't think it's simply because they wanted to be benign, and it's or that they suddenly love their country more, but it's also somehow that they, probably two forces there that are mainly there. One is they need rents to keep the coalition of power together. Keeping power costs money. And you need to be able to have the ones that keep you in power to keep on being supported. So growth becomes like something, well, I may well have to do it because otherwise I can't pay off different players. On the other hand, you may also do it for legitimacy, growth and development for legitimacy. So I begin to grow and I want some form of performance legitimacy, i.e., I want to actually show to the people that we as the elites are rightly here. Now, all these things, of course, creates a complicated balance because both of these things means you may want to grow, but at the same time, you get new aspirations emerge, new elites emerge, and so on. And so I find it interesting that quite a lot of the countries have gambled on development, on growth in recent times. But it also has important lessons that, however much we want to think about that it should be ordinary people pushing development or whatever, we should just recognize, not least in weak institutional environments, that it's the elites that have the power. So you do need them to do it, even if we don't like them or whatever. The people with power need to actually be part of the kingdom. So I call this kind of, we need to have an elite bargain for development. We need to have a development bargain amongst these people that actually want to do it. And it's a tricky one, but what we see in the countries that I kind of studied also in the book, and that includes the Ghanas, the Ethiopias, the Indonesias, China, and so on, they are very different in lots of different ways. How they did it in economic terms, even in political, organizational terms, even with very different state capacity. But what they had in common is that somehow or another there was an implicit elite pact, an elite bargain, not with all the elite in it, but a strong enough one that said, look, we're actually going to do this. And that's actually what I find interesting. And that's, trying to understand also in the book I wrote is about, you need to try to understand what the incentives are of elites. If we don't see progress happening, like in Democratic Republic of Congo or in Nigeria to some extent, you'll get very far to understand by understanding the elite incentives. Why are they keeping the status quo? Why don't they not doing it? It can either be the coalition is too fragile, or it's just they just love the status quo as it is, and they want to capture the rents, and there's very little interest in growing the pie, and they keep the control of the rents very limited, and so on. And so you get whole series of countries, probably about 35 now, maybe 30, that actually are still around low-income country, that actually have seen very little change in that. But we see another group, about 20 low-income countries, that actually have grown quite fast. And I'm not saying it's paradise, but they got further. They took the gamble and they progressed.
Well, thank you very much. It was a very clear explanations of the main arguments of the book, and I think we should recommend our audience to read it because what you draw is fascinating. The second question I want to ask is: do you think that this argument, this framework that you draw, is transferable to other contexts, such as green transition, and how could elites gamble on green transition when there are huge costs but not immediate return and a lot of risks?
Yeah. Look, I think there's so many different contexts, and we just have to look today at the way what the US looks like these days, the way geopolitics is moving, that actually a simple framework from understand the incentives and the motivations of those who have power remains a powerful framework for almost any context where coordination is required to make progress. And that's actually it. Now, it could be that the groups for a green transition and so on may not necessarily be as narrow, as broad. Maybe it doesn't involve the same thing, but these have to be about coalitions of power where there will be possibly short-term costs. They need to have a way of handling these within the coalition and then to be able to progress. So this is in economic terms, this is basically, these are coordination games. Can we actually coordinate and be credibly coordinating to make this progress? Now, the green transition is an obvious one here because, without the participation of different players within a country, and indeed across the world, it's extremely hard to do. We see it in every country. There will be lobbies that have vested interests that are very strongly against it. And as we've seen in United States politics, and we see unfortunately increasingly now in European politics, it's very easily for them to mobilize allies in it. But yes, because some of these things will be costly in the short term. And so I can organize groups, even amongst ordinary people, to support it. So you kind of need, again, a coalition. Now, does it need to be just the elites? I don't know. But at the same time, if the elites don't want it, it won't happen. And that's in any country in the world. They always have the power to block things. And that's what we clearly observe. They can have it. They can do this by mobilizing people and arguments that, oh, well, like in a city like Oxford, we shouldn't have a congestion charge or whatever. Or indeed, that a bigger thing, we should just have free license to drill a baby drill, whatever it is. But it's a similar thing. Can we build a strong enough coalition within the countries and then actually globally to do this? And that's been the drama of the entire green transition, because we thought we were slowly beginning to get closer to it. And it doesn't feel like present anymore. And we probably now made multiple steps back. So we'll have to do that again. So yes, so such a framework, but it's not just because the book says it, it's actually quite standard also as a political economy tool of analysis to actually think in these terms about it.
Well, thank you. And you wrote this book during COVID, if I remember well. It was published in 2020. What has changed since then? And if you were to write it today,
Yeah.
what assumptions would you challenge the most?
So look, I wrote it, and this was very much looking back at a particular age. Also, I learned a lot about lots of these countries, not just because I was an academic. As academics, we try to answer very small questions, really. When I worked in the policy space in the 2010s, that's when I, of course, learned much more about the different countries. I had teams of political scientists and economists working on lots of different countries, so I could absorb quite a lot. But it's also, we have to be cognizant of, by the end of the 2010s, a particular age was changing. I cover basically the 1990s up to about 2020, but that was a period of globalization, of actually unipolarity in the world. This was, aid was technocratic. It was not highly politicized. It was always political, but not highly politicized. It was allowed to be fairly technocratic, and so on. It was actually multilateralism was still alive for much of that time. China was only beginning to emerge in much of the settings. Why I emphasize this? When you were in an environment which I think was actually very benign for a lot of developing countries to um, to have a global model to engage with to grow their economy, called globalization. Indeed, what a lot of the successful countries from Asia and a few from Africa have managed to do. There was a global model that you could engage with. So basically, if they didn't, you had to look inwards. It's a long answer to say, what would I do differently? Well, the global context is now a massive constraint on the ability of any country to set up its own elite bargain for development, to do its own gamble, because the opportunities for growth in this kind of environment through the tried and tested route from export orientation, I'm not saying it's gone, it's probably still the only one, but it's actively hindered by the behaviors of virtually every big power. That's, of course, China's behavior, US behavior, but actually also Europe with its environmentally inspired and green transition inspired tariff walls and so on. It will just make it harder for these countries to actually find the route. So the ones who stay behind, it's much harder. It also is another part that I would do differently. It's the rush to get more natural resources. And that sense, the environment in these countries has changed. When, broadly speaking, aid was maybe, okay, it was an instrument to support the global liberal economic order. It was consistent with it. But arguably, and I will still say that, broadly speaking, was relatively benign, reflecting on the opportunities that some of these countries could have. Relatively speaking, definitely in economic terms, there were opportunities. Now, it seems to be very different. The interest in a lot of these countries is not they will be our global partners and maybe our future trading partners. No, they have rare minerals and they have natural resources and they have oil, and we need to do this. That is actually much more like the 1980s, when we had the Cold War and where actually development was absolutely screwed up. It was an absolute mess because it was an instrument in the Cold War by all the different parties. Once you get that, and you're going to get you're also going to get aid and international foreign policy towards countries. They're going to be you got to a situation where, look, I write in the book, for example, about the Democratic Republic of Congo. And Congo is absolutely not an elite bargain for development. And a lot of international players have been quite cautious engaging with it in say in the 2010s or something. Now they have minerals, they have oil, they have natural resources, they have everything. And so you hear people saying, oh, of course we must give aid to the DRC, even though absolutely not interested in development as a government, but we must give aid because they need to be a new partner in this new global environment. So I would write definitely about that, the change in geopolitics and the way it actually gives even less chance for a genuine development bargain in countries to emerge, because those people who just want power and extraction and control of the resources for their own rent distribution, they will have a field day because we may well end up supporting them.
Yeah, you just referenced some of these really dramatic shifts that we've been seeing in the development world, and in geopolitics in general. And I guess sort of in that same vein, uh, with some of these devastating cuts from Western countries, particularly the United States, um, in response, we've seen the development sector really begin to think about and rely on private funding. Um, with Alexander De Croo, head of the UN Development Program, recently stating that, quote, he has absolutely no doubt that today the private sector is really the core of development. So how do you think, if at all, this shift toward private funding is going to um, influence the development space and contribute to sort of that phenomenon you were speaking about?
Wow. Okay. So, look, in the way I think about it, is that bringing aid, and whether it's through supporting private businesses to invest in places, or whether it's through direct aid of the previous form or social sector aid, as the idea would do, the health kind of things and so on. Irrespective of that, if within a country there isn't any clear commitment to actually do development as well and themselves as much as possible, all that aid that comes in is at best doing some good. It definitely doesn't transform countries. And at worst, it embeds the status quo. That's also, we should in the aid sector be willing to learn that lesson from the past. So the countries where aid from any types of organization, we can look back at and saying, look, it was probably quite effective, was in those countries where actually generally they had their own serious development project and serious, they wanted to do, developing their own country as well. You can go back. I remember one of my predecessors, was never popular with ministers I was advising, but one of my predecessors, chief economist of DFID, said, look, aid probably was the most effective from the UK side when it was giving aid to Western China. And why was this? Because China was absolutely committed to bring poverty down in Western China. That was a big target to bring poverty down. Now, whether we like the government or not, but aid is a financial means, is a technical cooperation. Well, you need someone who actually also wants it to work.
Right.
And so we see that as well, that in some countries aid was quite successful, and not just in autocracies, I must emphasize. Yes, it has been always quite effective, say in the Rwandas, but it was also pretty good in Bangladesh, where it was allowed to be spent through NGOs and big international NGOs being very effective in bringing social sector spend or supporting social sector via the NGO sector. It was good in Ethiopia, in Ghana. There's lots of countries where it was pretty. But we have to be willing to learn the lesson and saying, giving aid to Nigeria or Malawi, if neither of these governments fundamentally seems to be interested in development, you're just prolonging the status quo. You may do good, but then you prolong. Now, why do I come with this kind of shifts from the future that we're getting at? Of course, there's much less money. Funnily enough, and I have slightly controversial view maybe here in it, I don't mind that there is less money in the aid sector at the moment for one reason. I will first qualify this to say, of course, I do mind that there are abrupt changes that are happening in the lives that are affected. But I don't mind that in this environment that I was earlier describing, where aid is going to be transactional part of the geopolitical game, I don't want endless money being spent on the DRC and not on some country that generally wants an independent focus on developing its own country. We say, oh, no, we can't pay on it because you're not fully aligned with us and votes in the Security Council. So I don't mind, because in the 1980s, it was bad. Aid allocations were bad, and we were trying to do all kinds of things with that. So in that sense, because actually too much money would be risky. Now, when Alexander De Croo says these things like we have to look at the private sector, I say, yeah, it's all good. I'm a big fan of FDI, and usually foreign direct investment is actually a pretty good tool, because actually they despite what often people think, and I'm not talking just natural resources, but I mean just generally investment in it, because many of these companies that invest internationally, they're listed on stock markets where they need transparency, and they're actually a bit more careful. So often they it's much more tricky it's much easier in a domestic firm to be totally politically connected and being linked in the whole thing. So I'm a fan of this private sector money. But we have to recognize what I'm alluding to already here is that actually in this kind of weak institutional environment, the idea that there is the private sector is a big illusion. Some firms are just making money from being connected to the state to all kinds of possible means, procurement, fraud, and whatever. And other firms are actually generally trying to do fully private sector, because in a world of weak institutions in many of the countries, there is no separation between the state formally and what's happening. And so you get these kind of things as well. So I don't know, to be honest, what he actually means, the private sector. No, we need investment. There's no country that investment is the root of all growth in any country. Wherever it comes from, it's good, but we have to be conscious that there is no such a thing as the private sector. Just really thinking about, can there be an independent private sector that brings in productive capabilities and so on? And we don't necessarily want to strengthen the friend of the presidents, the friends of the president that in some country that just wants to sustain the status quo.
I mean, in a sort of ideal world, the goal of development would be to enable a country to begin development and then eventually be autonomous.
Of course.
And do you think that there might be a sort of conflict of interest if we begin relying significantly on private funding in sort of allowing this autonomy to eventually emerge? If there's sort of a profit interest there, how that might complicate this issue of like indispensability that the development sector has often created?
Well, look, there's no country that ever brought down its poverty without actually growing its economy. Okay. Private funding, private sector does best when it does private sector stuff. And it does it best when it doesn't try to just influence and lobby and create vested interest for itself. That's what we want. That's the success of across variations of our market economies across the world. It doesn't have to be purely capitalist. It can be, government can play a big role, but that's what you want. So if you say want it in any country, I'm always happy to hear, we get an investor into a place. We also want to see more domestic investment in all these places. So that's I'm not too concerned with. When you say private funding, of course, you may also allude to things like, it could either be philanthropy, where there's a different accountability framework. I get money from a billionaire, then I'm only accountable to that billionaire. The accountability thing, you have to just hope that the person means really well and actually has a good judgment. At the same time, you could also say, oh, well, we get private funding and we're going to set, for example, private parallel systems to government systems in health and education. Now, these can be good, but they're not necessarily. It's again, it depends on how you do that. And so So in itself, it's not the biggest problem, but you want to be careful. What I definitely strongly believe in, is what you also were describing. The only reason why we would want to engage with these countries from a developmental point of view would say, well, we wanted them to take ownership of their own destiny. And we want especially to work with those who actually generally are trying to do this, not with ideological ideas, but generally trying to learn how to actually develop their own country, their economies, their social sectors. And arguably the only purpose of aid should be is trying to get what they do themselves, maybe doing it a bit quicker or doing it a little bit better with some support. That has to be the aim. What we should never do is say, oh, well, we're going to build up a whole health system in parallel via private contractors. I mean, that's actually one of the things that I don't regret with the demise of USAID, that we were in some countries, there was more money spent through parallel USAID channels
Right.
than through the government system, saying, no, that can't be right here in the health sector. And then we see what happens once they step out, then it implodes. No, it all has to be about doing it. And by the way, that's also kind of means is that, we've been doing this lack of development aid for the last 60 years. So we should be glad that at some point we begin to face this down. Okay. And being very focused. So in that sense, latest things that we hear out of the US that, most development aid will now be focused on Latin America, which are largely middle income countries, many upper middle income countries. You have to really ask yourself, well, what is it that you're going to do?
Right.
What is it that you're going to do? While actually what we really want is these countries and some of them do reasonably well, progressing in the path of development and the ownership of their own development. And foreign money is only to model it in new transactional world.
I'm sort of wondering if kind of in this time of upheaval, if you see also an opportunity to kind of rebuild and redirect things that need to change in the development sector, and if so, what do you think is the most important thing to focus on?
Yeah. So I mean, in one sense, the first one I would mention where I already touched upon is that, refocusing on really thinking about we're talking development sector. It's not the kind of the extreme humanitarian needs sector and so on. We can come back to that. But if I talk in the development sector, is to actually say, well, don't make yourself indispensable. So don't build up these parallel systems that then forever you need to have in it. Generally ask the question, am I prolonging the absence of a health system in this country, or am I actually accelerating the existence of a health system in that country? And I don't care necessarily whether it's bit private, bit public. That's not the issue. But is there actually an emergent health system that can actually look after the population, and not something that's important with parallel systems, with structures, with our own accountability frameworks? So that's the first thing. Don't make yourself indispensable. And that's partly what we did. And then the second thing is being willing to be selective. We can all alleviate needs. But in countries where we alleviate need, without realizing that we lock in the status quo, we may actually harm future generations. And so be willing to do that calculation, just as we do about climate issues. But actually saying, there we're willing to think about future generations. But we're not willing to think about future generations in some of these countries. If we keep on giving aid to Malawi, if the political government and the elite in that country, in the civil service and in other parts, can't give a damn about actually seriously setting up their own systems, why do you do this? So it's basically, don't get driven by need, but think about actually where we actually started as development, which is actually thinking about how can this accelerate development. So of course we can do good, but I don't think it's good enough, because then it's again, we prolong this whole thing. And probably that relates to it, be willing to be selective. At the moment, this whole needs-based model, or for example, in multilateral system, like everybody should get something, like the IDA in the World Bank, the concessional loans, every country gets their quota. I mean, for a bunch of economists in Washington, that's terrible incentives. And to basically say, look, basically we get a situation where countries that actually are trying to develop get pushed get a bit of that money, but they probably can actually absorb more and do more. And then they push to international debt markets where interest rates are high. And then countries that actually don't give a damn and actually don't want to do anything, they still get the loans. And they don't have to go to the private markets and that thing. Be willing to be selective. Now that's a tricky one, but it's definitely one of the lessons. I don't know exactly how you do this and how you do this transparently, but the lesson has to be just everybody gets it and will with some vague justification of need. It's going to create just more problems in the future as well. Yeah. So I think there's things that we can do, but it needs courage and it needs really rethinking what we.
And how would you respond to maybe some criticisms of this, idea that when we're enforcing this selectivity, um, that it might also mean there are some ethical issues that could arise from abandoning people who are living in authoritarian or poorly governed states.
Yes. Yes. I mean, one of the things that is already quite uncomfortable, I think, in all this is that, there are democratic and authoritarian states that actually want to try to do development. Malawi is a democracy, and I have no signs that actually any of the recent governments ever really tried to do something serious. And they were just driven by the vested interests. So it's not necessarily that. But yes, of course, there is a criticism. But we're living at the same time in an environment where we all talk then about effectiveness and the return to the scarce resources. And then you ask yourself, okay, is it the right model where you have limited resources and we spend it on a place where the rate of return is close to zero, and we spend it on a place where actually the rate of return is very high? That doesn't sound to be like a sensible way of managing public finances of donor countries either. So you have to be a bit careful on the kind of do things. And this is a bit like where we can also be very short-sighted. In some sense, you quote a humanitarian principle, need alone, that is about support today for the people that need it. But if you then condemn the next generation to be dependent on resources we can't promise beforehand, and indeed we're now cutting, that makes actually that all a bit of a hollow promise. And so actually something to thinking. And from an ethical point of view, in a dynamic principles, you need to take into account the future. And a future of dependency and status quo and elites that will keep on doing what they're doing by actually replacing the state and satisfying the needs of people because there's need today. I'm not sure that is ethically necessarily, which one is necessarily better. And I do think, we want to give some weight to the future generations as well.
I mean, you sort of had referenced earlier in our conversation this return to the 1980s model of development, and resource extraction and all of these things. Um, and so I suppose on that note, wondering what your thoughts would be on the recent events in Venezuela that have created sort of this unique crisis of governance and legitimacy, and if from a development economics perspective, what realistic steps would Venezuela need to stabilize economically and politically in a way that could seed a development bargain?
So, wow. The, I mean, look, I may see, say, Africa or bits of Asia evolving um, into a bit of the 1980s. Unfortunately, in the backyard of the US, the official doctrine is late 19th century, early 20th century. And it's mind-boggling, okay? And the internal consistency and how to actually see this playing out. Now, having said this, um, I have no idea. I mean, I have no idea how this will evolve in the short term. But if you were to ask me slightly differently, it's like, irrespective of the recent events and extraction of a leader out of a country and regime change and vassal status or whatever it is, or slave status of Venezuela now, maybe or maybe not. A country like that was absolutely suffering from this real uh, elite bargain controlled around you have resources. So I don't really need to have growth and development because I have resources. I can distribute them to whoever I choose to. I can pay off to some extent ordinary people, but I can meanwhile also pay off all the friends in the whole coalition. I don't think I need to build up an economy, and I don't need to grow the economy to create the rents to keep on distributing. And in fact, rising oil prices and given all their reserves, in principle, I had it. Of course, it's a mind-bogglingly terrible management that they did of that resource. But of course, it comes with, massive amounts of resource and then all kinds of vested interest that they did it so badly. I mean, if you have all that money, you should have been able to manage this better. But they didn't, and ideology and all the things come there. In the end, you are there dealing with a country that is highly natural resource rich. So one of the advantages you have is that if you generally want to do a development deal and generally want to build up the economy, there are technical issues on managing a resource-rich economy. We talk often about Dutch disease and the incentives not to develop your own productive sectors. But we also have examples like, okay, maybe not the kind of same extent of natural resources, but we can think of Indonesia in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, that actually had natural resource wealth, actually similar to Nigeria and Indonesia, did use it to invest in its own country. It did support the agricultural sector as well, yes, also with bits of subsidies for farmers and so on, bit as a safety net issue as well. But they invested quite a lot. They built up their investment climate, and then after a while, a very large proportion of people's shoes in the world in globalization were made in Indonesia. So they they managed to overcome this. So it's something that Venezuela could have done, and arguably could still think about if you actually get serious management of natural resources, investing in your own investment climate. So that does mean careful with your exchange rate. It's not overvalued, that you actually get some kind of incentives for exports, or at least your local economy to compete with imported goods. All these kind of things should be possible. Good technical management of these economies, it's not easy, but it's possible. If you have all the wealth, you can invest in all the infrastructure you want, but you need to have a fundamental commitment to actually make that work, and not an economy that is based on short-term rent distribution and doing everything you can, as they did over the last few decades, to stay in power, to buy people off locally, all the way to ordinary people. It's not just that they all put it in the Cayman Islands, but it's definitely not. They've never built up an economy, and that's what you should be doing. Will this now happen with another set of investors taking over the oil with the same incentives, rent distribution, which is basically distributed partly back to the US? I'm not sure what that will look like. But yeah, it's possible, but it takes serious economic management and serious political.
Well, Professor, thank you for this incredible and fascinating overview of development and ODA. And in the last part of this interview, we will more focus on your personal journey as a development economist. So, very simple question. Why did you choose to work in policy development?
Well, you know, so we all have our own stories, and for some reason, I actually could tell you when I was first inspired to actually work on development. And it's one of these strange things that I still remember being exposed to it, and I was about 12, 13 years old. And I was actually in my first year or my second year, maybe in secondary school, second year it was, and I had a religion teacher who had a deeply conservative priest, good Catholic background that I had, and went to the school there. But he had worked in what they call basic communities in Brazil, this kind of low-level, ordinary communities where, this is 1960s Brazil, where there was mixtures there with, left-wing rebellions, a bit of interest there in marrying Christianity with communism and all the kind of thing, good, all kinds of things, but because it was a hugely unequal and still is a hugely unequal society, and these were desperately poor people. Now, I will say he was a deeply conservative person, but he made us actually read a little bit about Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, Ujamaa, African socialism, and actually, not that I understood it, but it was something like villages that were working, and talked a bit about Brazil as well. And again, absolutely not that he was kind of a lefty or whatever. I just found it fascinating. I never forgot that. And I found it so interesting to hear what was happening. I kind of decided I'm going to work on development. And then, of course, we all have our own stories. I ended up hating physics and chemistry. So I was going to be an agriculturalist. I was going to work on agriculture. And then somehow shifted into the econ. But yeah, I will always wanted to do this. And also consciously thinking about, I always wanted to do policy.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but I studied economics, and you feel that's close to policy. But then when I finished my master's degree, nobody wanted to give me a job. When I finished my DPhil, my PhD, nobody wanted to give me a job in any of the international organizations. So I became an academic. But it's actually helped me a lot, because that's maybe another part to actually think about it. I'm very glad that I actually ended up spending so many decades first doing it as an academic, because it forced me, first of all, to learn to be precise, and to actually, not just being political in that space, having some kind of pseudo ideological view and prejudice, but actually forcing myself to be self-critical. That is what you're saying really right. And if someone makes you change your mind, that you do it. But then, and then, as most people's careers, there's a bit of luck involved. Why would they appoint a Belgian as chief economist in a British aid organization? Wouldn't have happened in France or in Belgium. Uh, but they did, and then I stayed, and I think that's a fascinating world. And but it is, my journey is there, um, doing this. I was lucky to, um, after I couldn't get a job, after my PhD, I managed to end up teaching as my first job, teaching in Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia. And so spending time with young scholars in that kind of environment, it definitely also shaped me, because it's so easy to do it from a rich country, to think about these places, but actually trying to understand how it is to think about it when you're based there in these own universities made me always respect definitely, at least the attempts that, young economists, in this case inside Africa, are making, trying to make sense of the realities that they actually have, and actually doing contributions. So it's, we all have our journeys.
Okay. And you're now talking about gambling on development, and from academics to policy advising, there are very different challenges and maybe responsibility when you're in the closes of a policy advisor. How do you think of responsibility when you're advising on policies that could affect millions
Yeah.
of lives?
That's a very good question. Okay. So, first of all, as an academic, it's actually quite striking. Working in the policy environment has first made me think much more about our own accountability as academics. Okay, so we could say, oh, we have accountability to the truth, and so, or to peer review and so on. But it is tricky. We live in a society. We choose the topics ourselves to work on. We decide what is important, not important ourselves. So there's first thing, the accountability goes beyond that. In a policy environment, I agree with that as well. But I also would say, as an academic, you can't avoid having some responsibility, because if you all start talking about a certain topic because it's cool academically to talk about, you do influence generations of students to think about it, and so on. And it's about what is important, not important. In a policy environment, um, look, the moment that I really realized what it was like to work and live in relatively strong institutions, like working UK civil service in the UK that has strong institutions in some sense, was when I had to appear in front of a parliamentary committee in London. And this quite the first time I had to do it, joining my minister, and they asked me quite a lot of questions. And I remember thinking, the kind of arrogant academic as some of us sometimes are, what stupid questions. But I do remember, and I honestly vividly remember walking out of Westminster, at the Palace of Westminster in London, and just walking out and thinking, wow, this is the first time in my life I've been to account. And that's actually quite important, that when you're an advisor, there has to be a mechanism to be held to account. Okay. And in that sense, doing this within the UK system, I was very, very, very fortunate in that. At the same time, I'm very concerned. Sometimes I do it in other places, in other countries, in a few countries at the moment. And yeah, the easy way out is to say what often advisors say. Advisors advise, politicians decide. But it does create a moral responsibility. If there's no external accountability, you have a moral responsibility to actually really think about the things that you just described. And I think that's really important, An advisor without a moral fiber is actually a dangerous advisor. And we see a lot of them around. So yeah, it comes back to, if there is no external accountability, you have to have it internally. You have to do it. And it makes me think. I'll give you a concrete example. I work a lot in Pakistan at the moment. I advise and I try to support, and it's generally my belief, and it's consistent with the thing in the book, we need to find a way of that country that's totally stagnant, massive vested interest and totally captured. But growing the economy is probably, the minimum amount that we need to be able to do. First of all, to have resources again to get health and education service and other social protection and so on, to have some liquidity. But secondly, also to begin to shake up all the vested interest in the economy. For the reason that I said, it will challenge, and we need to be willing to do it. There's a small number of people, even in the political space, that are willing to do it. But I'm working on growth, while fundamentally, I worry about that many of the people that I need to bring on board in the bit of the coalition, in the elite bargain, are only interested in the growth. And they're not necessarily interested in distribution. Now, I know there will be some positive effects, but deep down, I started as a poverty economist, and I'm very concerned and I'm very interested in. And so you can ask yourself, am I actually doing enough on that? But I do know that that's my entry point, is around growth. And so you have to work on it. But again, you have to keep on being willing to be aware, and you have to have people like you asking me that question once in a while and asking, is this correct what you do, and what is your source of accountability, and how do you hold yourself to account in these matters?
Thank you.
I guess before we close out, we wanted to close with a slightly different question that's just in a different direction. Is there a book unrelated to economics that you would like to recommend to our audience?
And there is I was over Christmas, I was begin to read the kind of things that I read when I don't want to read academic work, which is basic. But the one that I want to recommend, anyone who ever listens to anything to do with Oxford will, of course, know about malls. There is actually a writer who also lives in Oxford, and he's again setting murders in Oxford. And I live in just a village inside the ring road, Tivoli village. Mm-hmm. And the guy was basically, it was all taking place on my road. So the author is Simon Mason, and he has already 4 books out, and he's just a very good crime writer, and I so enjoyed it. And the title of the book that I liked most was A Voice in the Night, which was basically, I think the house opposite me, their murder happened. That's incredible.
Wonderful.
Can really get into it. Well, yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. Really enjoyed this conversation and the insights you had for us. And yeah, thanks for joining.
Well, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.